Good morning and welcome to the next in our series of knowledge banks brought to you by News on the Block. Today's session is presented by James Paul from Earl Kendrick, and he's covering the topic of insurance reinstatement cost assessments. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to James. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout. And James, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm just about to start sharing my screen with you all, so hopefully you should see the slideshow pop up in just a second. I think we have it there. So yes, this morning's presentation is on unlocking the mysteries of the RCA, that is the reinstatement cost assessment, for those of you who are not familiar with the term. And just in case there's anyone wondering, what is an RCA? Well, they are one of these things that have quite a lot of different names in the industry. You may have heard of the term insurance valuation or building reinstatement valuation. All of these things essentially mean the same thing. So whether you call them BRCAs, RCAs, IVs, or BRVs, building reinstatement valuations, they are all essentially the same product. So we'll take you through why they are needed. We'll play a little game of guess the declared value very shortly, and then we'll walk you through the processes of how we undertake an RCA, how we measure them, what's included and what's excluded, where we get our figures from, and of course the subjects of that, along with some case studies and a question and answer session. So hopefully, despite it being the rather dry subject of insurance, will keep your attention and not make it too boring. So first of all, what is an RCA? Well, it's the basis adopted by the RICS for appraising a property and its M&E equipment. Essentially, it is the way we work out how much it costs to rebuild a building. And this is important because we'd all like to know that we're paying a fair premium on our buildings insurance. Obviously, a big block of flats costs a lot more to rebuild than a 3-bedroom semi-detached house. And whilst most of you could probably have a stab at how much it would cost to rebuild a 3-bedroom house, you might not have so much of an easy grasp on how it might be if you were trying to work out the value of, let's say, a block of 14 flats with some underground parking and a little bit of a shop or something tacked onto the side. It all gets rather complicated then. And it can also be used to assess things like outbuildings, roads, car parks, private estates, complicated gardens or landscaping, just about anything really that you might want to insure as part of the building. And so here is a rather typical looking buildings insurance schedule with the sort of sensitive data kind of redacted out there. And as you can probably see, there's a few different numbers on there. And the one that we're interested in is this one here, the building declared value, or DV. And you might have noticed that this £14 million figure is slightly smaller than this figure over here, which is the building sum insured. Now, the reason why these two figures are different is because the building declared value is the one that surveyors like me actually go around working out. And the building sum insured is a slightly different figure, can sometimes be exactly the same as the declared value, but in this instance, it's a little bit higher. And this is a derived figure that the insurance broker or underwriter comes up with. And it's slightly different in the sense that with this, they have added on some other, less tangible factors that effectively elevate the valuation. So these things might be the alternative accommodation, which you can see a couple of cells down from that £18 million figure, and other factors such as terrorism and various other things. And the £18 million figure there is what the premium's actually based upon, even though the lion's share of that is the building's declared value. So here you can see, of course, they've slotted in an alternative accommodation cost of 33% of the limit of the building's declared value. So that caps their exposure a little bit. And in total, this has resulted in these people paying about £16,500 for their premium that year. Now, the underlying premium, if you look a couple of cells above, is actually only about £9,000. But on top of that, you've got terrorism cover and the rather pernicious insurance premium tax, something that was brought in by George Osborne about 5 or 6 years ago and has been creeping up as a stealth tax ever since. So that is a building's schedule of insurance, really. I mean, you'll have probably seen one of these many times before or something very similar to it. And what you may have noticed is that that £16,000 figure equates to a charge of roughly about £180 for every £100,000 worth of insurance. And that's important to note, because if you compare this to a sort of normal freehold single dwelling house, perhaps some of you own your own houses, live in your own houses, that sort of thing. If you take a typical 3 or 4 bedroomed house that's out in the suburbs and owned by one person and occupied only by one family, you'll probably be paying something like, I don't know, £120, £150 a year with somebody like Tesco Insurance for your own buildings insurance. And maybe you'll be paying a bit more, but a lot of it will depend on your declared value. And a lot of private ordinary residential houses actually have declared value cover up to the level of about £600,000 these days, even though a lot of the time normal dwelling houses will often cost a lot less than that to rebuild. You know, sort of £200,000 could be the typical kind of figure these days. So insurance for blocks of flats where there are lots of different occupiers, especially those in big cities, can cost significantly more. £180 is not unusual. In fact, we'd say anything between £150 and £200 is becoming quite typical nowadays. So that's the insurance schedule. Moving on a bit, here's I suppose a very plain and ordinary block of flats. This is actually a block that we surveyed over in Manchester about a year ago. It's a 1970s block. It's something that would now be thought of as affordable rent, i.e. just above the social housing sort of level of fit out. The flats, I can tell you there's 12 of them, and they're about 50 square meters each. Obviously, you've got internal common parts in there as well. So probably the the gross external area, or the IPMS1, as you might want to call it, is about 750 square meters. And perhaps in the chat room, chat window, what you could all do now is have a guess at how much that block of flats would cost to rebuild. You can see an outline of it in plan on the picture to the right, and you can obviously see a photo of it on the front just to the left. But on the basis of those very sort of, broad figures, 750 square meters and 12 flats, those of you who are brave enough, why don't you have a go at plugging in a guess as to how much you might think it would cost to rebuild that building. Just stick it in the chat window and see what we come up with. I can see a few people are beginning to stick a few things in, which is great, always good to see. And just carry on. Yep, brilliant. Yep, 7 or 8, 9 people, it's all happening now. Fantastic. Okay, so give you another moment or two just to fire in a few more guesses. Let's see what it came up with. Okay, so this is the figure that block of flats came to without the VAT being added on. So if you got something in that region, give yourself a pat on the back. That is pretty close. But what I can reveal is that if you added on the VAT to that figure, you'd actually get this figure, 1.323 million. Now, that's interesting because obviously if you look at the VAT exclusive figure, this higher figure is not an exact 20% increase on it. And that is because VAT isn't applied universally across everything in an RCA. An RCA is a compound figure. A declared value is a compound figure that includes things like planning application fees and various other items that don't necessarily attract VAT. So you can't always switch between a VAT exclusive figure and a VAT inclusive figure with ease. In a RCA situation, you really need to know how the figure was derived and built up in order to do that. So coming on to that in a little bit, obviously, in greater detail, but just for the time being, have a look at this building here. Here's another version of the same question. Here we've got a slightly more complicated building. It's called Woodside, and it's got a couple of garage blocks as well. 3-story structure, similar sort of age as to the last block of flats that we looked at in Manchester, but this one's actually in sort of the outskirts of London in Surrey. Have a go at guessing how much that one might cost. I can tell you that there's 15 units in this block of flats, so similar number to the last one, but they're perhaps a little bit nicer, and obviously it's a little bit more of a sort of slightly expensive area of the country to build in. So what do we think this one will cost, given that the last one was about 1.3 million with the VAT? Well, here we go. Now there's a bit of a shocker, isn't it? £4 million. How on earth can that block of flats cost sort of 3 or almost 4 times the amount as the block of flats before? Well, a lot of it comes down to the level of finishes internally, and also the fact that we're including quite a bit of tarmac and some garage blocks as well. But it's just there to illustrate that it's really not possible to actually sort of work out these values without conducting a thorough assessment. In this case, with the 15 flats, they were coming out at £278,000 a unit, a rebuild rate of approximately £2,700 a square metre. And that might be for all kinds of different reasons, such as more expensive fire detection equipment, variations in the finishes in the corridors and internal common parts. There could be lifts in the building. Actually, in this case, there aren't, but in other buildings, especially once you get to sort of 4 stories, it's not that uncommon to get lifts. And all of these factors will increase the overall cost of rebuilding. So stepping it up again, here's another block of flats. Again, we'll play another game of guess the declared value here. This is a converted Victorian school that's been divided up into flats. This time we're over in Islington in northeast London. And we've got 34 units here. They managed to create 34 flats out of that old Victorian school building. It is about 4,500 square metres. Those of you who like to think about these things in square metres, keep the guessing coming through on the Q&A. That's good. And we've got a rather nice little glass atrium in the centre of the building. I don't know if you can see the photo on the right hand side, but where the pointer is just there, that is a triple height atrium in what used to be a courtyard. And there's lots of nice period features here, you know, big, large sash windows letting in lots of lights and reasonably high quality glazing and so on and so forth. What do we think a building like that could cost to rebuild? Bear in mind that with RCAs, we are having to rebuild that building in a reasonably like-for-like manner. Obviously, you'll never get a Victorian school building looking exactly like a Victorian school building if you built it using modern materials, but the thinking is, in reinstatement terms, you'd be aiming for something similar. So in this case, I can reveal we're looking at about £15 million to rebuild that building. That's working out at £440,000 a unit, which is quite high, considering that some of the one-bed flats there probably aren't worth that much, more than £440,000 in an actual market sales scenario. But due to the quite considerable area of 4,500 square metres, the rebuild rate is actually just £3,339 a square metre, which, although it's high, is not necessarily as high as you might expect for a period building. And that's because you're beginning to get the economics of scale filtering through here. Obviously, if you are building something rather complicated and ornate, it involves a lot of different trades, it involves a lot of different skills, but the larger it becomes, the bigger a site it is, the more of a sort of economy you develop within the economies of scale argument. This is something that we find quite a lot with conducting reinstatement cost assessments, almost to the sense that it doesn't really matter to a certain degree how ornate a property gets. If you're building a really huge site with hundreds and hundreds of units, you start noticing that the overall cost will come down. And it's a curious effect that we've seen on several occasions before. Now, compared to this is a completely different kettle of fish. Here we're talking about one little mews house almost, and it's a very, very small building. It is just 181 square meters and contains just 4 flats served off a single stair core. It's actually a Regency era property, a very late Georgian in Pimlico in central London. Expensive part of town. You know, it cost you quite a lot of money to buy a flat in that building, despite its rather unassuming nature. But how much do you think it would cost to rebuild something like that? Looking at it, I mean, it's just basically bricks and mortar, a little bit of render and a few sash windows. Despite the postcode, that may not cost as much as you may think. And if you want to have a go at guessing this one, we're talking 181 square meters, we're talking 4 flats, and that's it. What do we think? I see a few guesses coming through here. Anyone else want to sort of hazard a guess? Put their reputation on the line? Well, here we go. I'll put you out of your misery. This is the figure, £846,000. That is less than £1 million. And that's including the VAT. That is all it costs to rebuild that structure. And at £211,000 a unit, you'd probably, in a lot of cases, have a hard time even getting the occupants to believe that their flats could be rebuilt for that sort of price, because some of those flats might be worth, you know, 2 or 3, possibly even 4 times that figure. And when someone lives in a flat that they bought for, let's say, nearly £1 million, getting them to accept that the rebuild value is just sort of £211,000 per unit, it can be quite a struggle. You know, we have some quite interesting conversations with these people. But if it contains fairly ordinary finishes, a lot of the time you can find that the market value is all wrapped up in the postcode rather than the actual quality of the construction materials that are used to build it. And this is, again, an interesting paradox that we come across time and time again in the world of RCAs. And we can get the inverse of this happening as well. We can come across flats and houses in the northeast of England or South Wales or certain bits of the country where we actually would struggle to rebuild them for the market value that they hold at the moment because of the increased cost of construction materials. So you can get the reverse of this happening as well. And we've almost finished this guessing game now. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend the entire presentation just playing a massive game of guess the value. But just to finish off for the time being, here is a really, really nice estate of properties. This is something called the Bromptons over in Chelsea. And you know, there's quite a few celebrities and high net worth individuals that live in this particular block. It used to be a hospital a long time ago, and it was converted into flats in the 80s, I think, or possibly the 90s. It contains an underground swimming pool, an underground car park, the gym, 24-hour concierge. The flats themselves are extraordinary. They generally sell for about £4 or £5 million each. You know, it's a gated development. It's got private gardens. You can see the size of it over on that picture on the right there. But just for fun, just before we go into the sort of slightly more boring bit of this presentation, how much do you think it would cost to rebuild something like that? Bearing in mind you'd have to replicate all of these ornate chimneys, all the sort of coins and details, the gatehouses, the gardens, all the sort of ornamental trees and the swimming pool and the massive underground car park there. Have a go. What do you think that would cost to rebuild? If you want the headline figures, it's 16,000 square meters. It's got 74 units, 74 flats, but obviously some of them are enormous, probably bigger than your house in a lot of cases, certainly bigger than mine. And yeah, I mean, these flats sell for about 4 million, even for the small ones. But this is the figure, 85 million. Believe it or not, it's only barely over £1 million a unit there. And although the rebuild rate of over £5,000 a square metre is pretty high, because of the economies of scale, those flats cost about a quarter of what they're worth on the open market to rebuild. And again, with the people that live there, getting them to understand that their flat is only really worth 1.15 million in an insurance valuation can be a bit of a struggle. They often think we've got our maths wrong and that we must have missed something and not noticed the gold leaf on the wallpaper when we walked in or something, because believe it or not, when a contractor is given a site of that scale to rebuild, they will price it in such a way that it is competitive with the open market, and they will realise a tender that works out approximately at £5,300 a square metre. So very, very interesting if you find these sorts of things fascinating like I do. So we're about 20 past 10 now, about a third of the way through the talk. Now we'll actually get into how we undertake RCAs as surveyors. I'm not going to bore you too much with this because I appreciate you know, the facts and figures side of it doesn't excite everyone, but just so that you can understand a little bit of the method in our madness, here's how we do it. So first of all, we review the existing plans, we look at previous RCAs, we review any licenses to alter, and we attend site and measure, and we produce what is called an elemental breakdown. And what this is basically a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet where we formulate our own figures and then cross-check them against something called the Building Cost Information Service. Now, this is a big compendium of build rates that's compiled by the RICS and is branded BCIS. And we also have our own in-house data, or our own in-house repositories of recently tendered projects and other things that we can look at. And this is where we get our figures from. Now, the guidance documents that control the way we undertake our RCAs as RICS registered firms are really controlled by these two booklets that you see in front of you now. Now, the pale blue one to the left is what's called a guidance note, and it's a bit more inferior in standing than the professional statement, which is the purple one on the right. Now, the purple one on the right defines the way we calculate areas, in particular International Property Measurement Standards 1 and 2, which are the main two that we use when calculating our RCA calculations. And the guidance note on the left, the blue and white booklet, is really I suppose my institution's method and guidance really on how surveyors should undertake RCAs. Now, every company has a slightly different way of doing it, but we have an established format in Earl Kendrick, which I'll go into detail on a little bit later. But essentially, the main thing to understand at the moment is the way that we calculate them here is through the elemental cost assessment method, which is important because it's more detailed and accurate than doing it through the sort of more broad brush approach that other surveying companies use. And the elemental cost assessment method looks at the way that the building is actually constructed and uses rates for the building elements, the brickwork, the type of stonework, the type of finishes, the type of kitchens and bathrooms that a flat has, and works it out from that basis, rather than through an aggregated basis of just houses in this particular county or flats in that particular postcode, which is the slightly more generalized approach other surveying firms can take. Now, these two sort of plan diagrams that you see in front of you now are essentially showing the difference between the IPMS1, or formal gross external area, in yellow, and the gross external floor area, which is its predecessor, in green on the right. So the main difference between those pictures, as you can probably see, is that the balconies, no matter how they are formed, whether they are recessed or open, are included in IPMS1, the yellow picture to the left, whereas they were excluded under the gross external area, which was used quite commonly by pretty much everyone until about 5 years ago. You do still get people, unfortunately, using the gross external area who haven't kept up with the times. But what the RICS says now is that external areas, or IPMS1s, should be calculated in this yellow format where you include the balconies. And this does have implications on blocks of flats, because obviously if your previous RCA was measured using the old gross external area definition, it may have grown the next time you have it done under IPMS1, because all the balconies and roof terraces and things will be included, whereas they weren't included beforehand. Now, if you compare it to internal areas, in this case, we've got a different coloured diagram. Again, the IPMS2, the contemporary way of measuring these areas, is shown on the left in yellow, and the old version, the grossly internal area, is shown in blue on the right. So again, even if you're using internal measurements, these two definitions have changed, and the way that these things worked out sort of 5 years ago is different to how they're worked out now, hence why buildings can grow even though there's been no obvious change to them physically. So how else are the measurements taken? Well, ideally we measure from as-built drawings, but we do always attend site to check the measurements. Internal measurements are there to confirm IPMS2, which closely matches the old gross internal floor area, although obviously not including balconies. And we use various devices, laser distance measurers, distos, trundle wheels to take measure sometimes. There are a number of ways that we can do this. And we inspect the mechanical and electrical equipment, we count the number of lifts and their types, and we take a record of any special features such as saunas, gymnasiums, underground car parks, anything at all like that. And then we go back to our spreadsheet once we get back to the office, and generally we always include balconies these days because of the international property measurement standards within our calculations. We also normally include internal permanent mezzanines, more on that later as to why we include them, and verandas and accessible rooftop terraces. All of these things are counted as part of the building, but we normally leave out open light wells from the area calculation, and the upper level voids of atrium. So if you've got a big fancy atrium in your block of flats, maybe where reception is and there's a triple height, big open space, we won't include that as a floor level, even if it spans 2 or 3 floor levels. We'll leave that out. And the way we normally calculate our RCAs, we normally leave out external car parking and external walkways from the area calculation, but then add them back in as separate calculations later, so they're still included in the overall building. Bit complicated, but it just leads to more real worldly figures. And in terms of including actual features of these buildings, we normally include obviously kitchens and bathrooms. Very few people take those sorts of things with them when they move house these days. Chandeliers, pendant lamps, ornamental plaster, any kind of fixed furnishings, anything that you might conceivably leave behind, that you might consider to be part of the house rather than part of your contents, like carpets, is included in an RCA. And similarly, when we're working out external areas, we'll treat trees and gardens in exactly the same way, lifts and escalators, and any kind of utilities, electricity, water, gas, sewer pipes, that sort of thing, if they're buried in private roads. And this is important because there's a lot of private housing estates out there that have roads and access ways which are not adopted by the local authority. And in a buildings insurance perspective, if those utilities are on private land, you can sometimes end up in a bit of a tussle as to whether they should be insured by the freeholder or whether they should somehow be treated as items belonging to municipal authorities. With things like sewerage pipes, they normally actually do belong to the local water authority, but with electricity, gas and data and this sort of thing, especially when it includes disturbing the tarmac atom to fix them, you can sometimes end up in arguments with insurers over who actually owns it. And I suppose with exclusions, we don't count sofas and armchairs and any kind of movable furniture. Machinery and business assets, if we're doing a commercial RCA, again, we won't include them. And gym equipment, running machines, rowing machines, that sort of stuff. Even if we're insuring the gym in a big block of flats, we won't include movable assets like that. And of course, any kind of movable healthcare adaptations. If someone's got, a specialist sort of disabled, lift that gets them in and out of the bath or something like that, even if it's sort of semi-fixed to the building, if it's something that perhaps belongs to the local health authority or or another provider, or it's rented or leased, if it's not strictly speaking part of the building, we probably wouldn't include that. But the important thing to remember is we will exclude or include anything the client wants. So if you want us to do an RCA, but for some reason or other you don't want us to include any of the gardens, you don't want us to include, I don't know, the roof terraces for whatever reason, we'll do one like that for you. We can tailor this to how you and your insurance broker want it to be. So the most important thing to take away from all this is communication. We have a default setting, but it's not fixed in stone. If you want a bit of a bespoke service that includes or excludes something unusual, just let us know. So back to the BCIS. What is this? Well, it's a collection of bills of quantities from different projects across the nation. It's compiled by the RICS and put into a big compendium, which surveying firms like Earl Kendrick, my own one, can then investigate and interrogate for a monthly fee. And it's useful because it helps. Obviously, we have our own sources of in-house data, but it's good for us to double check these against tendered rates from across the country from other contractors and consultants and so on. And it contains things like average price tables, reinstatement tables, and small basic calculators. And these all have their own uses in collaboration with our own approach, just to make sure that the sort of figures that we're spitting out at the end of our elemental cost assessments are what I suppose I like to call real worldly. You know, it's just enhances our own accuracy. And if you've not seen what BCIS looks like before, here's a couple of screen grabs. It's a bit generic, you know. I mean, you can filter in and out of, you know, residential types, and it breaks things down into flats and flat conversions. And then if you get a bit more detailed, it will split the quality into good, basic, and excellent. But the important takeaway from this is that these are very, very broad brush approaches. This is not as accurate as an elemental cost assessment. If somebody came up to you and said to you, what kind of house do you live in? Is it basic, good, or excellent? You'd probably give them a bit of a strange look, and we would too, because essentially this is a very, very blunt way of separating out the massive variation that you get in buildings. And we consider that the elemental cost assessment method is more detailed and therefore more accurate, but it's still good to keep an eye on BCIS just to make sure we are you know, broadly on track with what the rest of the world is thinking. And then moving on to the elemental cost assessment method again. I mean, here we've heard a lot about this. This is an excerpt from SPONS, which is basically a builder's price book, which breaks down buildings into their elemental costs. And I know the text is very small, but in that screen grab on the right hand side, if you look very, very closely, you can probably see that this building is split into what we tend to call the common arrangement of work section. So you've got demolition, foundations, ground floor frame, external walls, that sort of thing. And the important thing about this is if you're dealing with a building like that converted Victorian school that we saw earlier, which has, you know, perhaps some very fancy ornate sash windows or something, you can fetch that in here. You know, you can include for a brick built Victorian wall, but then put in some nice windows to separate it from perhaps a more ordinary one that might be found in another building. And through this method, you can tweak an elemental cost assessment so that it, you know, broadly matches exactly what you're looking at. And this is how you develop that level of detail as a surveyor and produce those more accurate figures. Quick note on VAT here. Obviously, VAT, you know, can be a big contentious factor. And I won't read out that statement from HM Revenue and Customs, but just to sort of summarize, what it essentially says is that it's quite difficult to avoid paying VAT unless it's both a 100% residential building and that building has suffered a near or total loss. So in other words, if you're insuring a mixed use development, anything with any kind of commercial sort of shop on the ground floor or anything like that, straight away you're into a bit of a sticky situation if you don't include the VAT. And you know, even if it is 100% residential, if you have a, you know, a partial fire or something where there's a, you know, not every side of the building is completely razed to the ground, you know, you could end up paying VAT anyway. And in a situation where perhaps the building is 80% or 90% destroyed, but not 100% destroyed, the effect of that added VAT can exceed the VAT exclusive amount that the building could be insured for, which is why we've written a white paper on why we advocate including VAT in every circumstance. A little bit of a controversial statement to make in the surveying community at the moment. one of those things that the jury still seems to be out on. But we've essentially, kind of run us up the flagpole in our own way and written a white paper on the subjects. And if you're interested in that, you're more than welcome to download it at that link there. And all of these slides will be disseminated at the end of the talk, so that you can read them at your leisure and click on the links if you want to. So that was VAT. Moving on towards sort of, almost sort of 2/3 the way through the presentation now. So we'll start wrapping up, because there'll be a few questions and answers. I can see the chat windows, gone quite considerable in the last few minutes. But we believe that the important thing is, if you're ordering an RCA, use an expert. We're experts in dealing with residential and commercial RCAs, and we have clear communication and tried and tested procedures that really walk the property managers through this process and help them. It's important to note that we're on your side. If you're dealing with a surveyor who is perhaps a little bit difficult or lacking in their communication abilities, change your provider. Go to someone who is prepared to explain things and talk things through to you, and make sure that you get the service that you deserve as a client and a property manager. And we offer efficient preparation of reports, and we like to think our ones are clear and concise. As we move into the next section of this presentation, which deals with case studies, you'll see how often it is the case that often where RCAs go wrong, it's due to a disconnect in communication between the client, the insurance broker, and the surveyor. And getting the instruction right is normally one of the most important things you can do. Quite often, inconsistencies can develop when people just simply don't understand what the other one wants from it. So the big benefit of using Earl Kendrick is we're really, really keen on client communication and ensuring that we deliver the right sort of service for you. Of course, we're competitive as well, and we're industry experts, but the most important thing in all of this is that we give you what you want and need for your purposes. And that's the number one thing that I would take away from this. And whoever you use to get your RCAs, make sure they're delivering a top quality service for you. So moving away from all that boring maths with the elemental cost assessment, this is not a guess the declared value. You might be glad to hear. This is more of a story. This is a converted mill building up in Manchester, and as you can see, it's formed of two main wings with a sort of central unifying block and a rather nice little chimney. And we came across a situation here where we were asked to go out and assess it, and the past DV that we were given was for £40 million. Nothing strange about that. And we conducted our assessment, and it came to 26 million. And it's important to note at this stage that this block of flats is formed of two blocks with a central unifying section with the chimney in, and they were actually sort of basically now run by two separate property managers. Originally, I believe the entire block had been managed by one property manager, but for whatever reason, the residents in one side of it decided they wanted to move to somebody different, and the block was essentially split for insurance purposes. And when we came along and told them that we'd carried out a thorough cost assessment and we worked out the reinstatement value to be 26 million, there were a lot of raised eyebrows, because the Residents Association had been insuring their bit of the block for £40 million, which is obviously a lot more. And very quickly, it unravelled that there'd been a miscommunication between the property managers when this block was handed over from the rest of the site. And the figure of 40 million, which was only 3 years out of date, was actually for the entire building, not surprisingly, including the chimney and both wings. And due to this miscommunication, the block that appears in the foreground of the photo in the left had then been insured by the new property management firm for 40 million when actually that was the figure for the entire site. So just on that little technicality, these poor people have been paying over the odds for their insurance for about 3 years. And we came in, conducted our assessment and gave them an accurate, up-to-date figure for just their portion. Now, what happens next, I'm afraid I don't know, but I imagine there were some quite serious questions raised by the directors with their property manager over the checks that were made, I suppose, when they took ownership of the block, and exactly what happened and why this bit of the building ended up being insured for the total value of the entire site. But needless to say, this is just I suppose a classic case of how these things can sometimes get lost in translation and mistakes can be made. Here's another situation that happened down in London for us a couple of years ago. Here we have a rather nice skyscraper in the Docklands in Canary Wharf. It was being insured for £30 million by the then property managers. They ordered a reinstatement cost assessment from someone, not us, but somebody different, and they came out with a figure of £78 million. You know, more than double the amount that was being insured for. So obviously, somebody thought there must have been some sort of mistake. A second, well, if you like, a fourth opinion was asked for, and the fourth surveyor came back with a figure of 77 million. And then finally, Earl Kendrick was brought in as the fifth surveyor, if you like, and we came out in a double blind setting at 76.5 million. So almost bang on neck and neck with the other two values. And what transpired in all of this, obviously, is that, you know, pretty rare to get three surveyors all being wrong about the same thing here. Why was this building being insured for 30 million? Well, it turns out that no one had actually conducted a reinstatement cost assessment on the building since it was constructed. The figure of 30 million had basically been derived by the insurance brokers, who were just updating an old figure using tender price indexes, and no one had actually really been to site and measured it or updated it properly since. And that figure of 30 million came from an earlier figure of 20-something million, which apparently was what the developer had spent developing the building, but not from scratch, but refurbishing an existing tower block that had basically been in its place before it was upgraded. So in this situation, you know, just the casual oversight of no one having ever ordered a proper RCA from the beginning had resulted in this rather unusual figure of 30 million pounds that's woefully underinsured being used as the actual insurance value for the property. So luckily, they caught that knife before it hit the floor, and I believe the building is now insured for an appropriate value. As you can see from the photo on the right, it's got some rather nice top floor roof terraces. It's generally a very high specification building, and you know, the good news is everyone now knows what it should be insured for. But if you do have any buildings in your portfolio where someone's telling you that, you know, oh yeah, it's £5 million or £10 million, but no one really knows why, and no one really can, you know, no one has any evidence that there's ever been a proper assessment done, it is worth getting an assessment done by a third party and finding out the truth, because the truth in these things can sometimes be surprising. But not everything in all situations actually does go up rather than down. Here's a happy ending for us to sort of not quite finish, but almost finished up on. This is a building down near Tower Bridge on the River Thames called Butler's Wharf. This is something that we got involved with about a year ago. And you may know it, you may have walked past it. Basically, it's another converted mill building. The ground floor level of that building is pretty much 100% demised to commercial units, shops, restaurants, cafes, that sort of thing. And everything above sort of first floor level is basically residential flats. So if you like, it's a mixed use development. And we were asked to work out just the residential portion of it. So Obviously, a simplistic approach might be to just ignore whatever's on the ground floor and just value whatever's on the first, second, third and fourth floors and so on. But what we noticed when we surveyed it is that there was an awful lot of M&E equipment on the roof, and you can see on that photo on the right all these different sort of ventilation shafts and ducts and extracts and things that actually belong to the commercial units on the ground floor. So pulling apart this building and separating the residential units from the commercial units was quite complicated, because you had all these shafts and ducts and things that served pizza ovens and bars and goodness knows what's along the ground floor that weren't actually part of the residential units. They were in effect part of the commercial tenants' fit out, and these commercial tenants had what's called fully repairing and insuring leases, meaning that they are responsible for insuring their bits of the building during the course of their tenure. And what what the residential block manager wanted us to do was to come up with a figure that was literally just for the residential flats themselves. So the lifts, the elevators, the internal common parts, people's private leasehold flats, but nothing else. And what we did was a very complicated but quite satisfying abstraction of all of this commercial catering equipment that was on the roof. And we basically worked out its value and then, you know, deducted it off the rest of the building and included for all the vertical shafts and things that passed through, you know, the sort of interfloor levels, and then also abstracted all the cafes and commercial units along the bottom as well. And we managed to get these people's insurance down from, I think it was 116 million 3 years earlier to 99 million pounds at the time that we actually conducted the assessment in 2020. So we saved them about 17 million pounds, which you know, is quite a sizable chunk when you're considering you're probably paying about 200 pounds for every 100,000 pounds worth of insurance that you're taking out these days. And despite the previous RCA being, you know, 3 years old, at this point we actually managed to bring them a cost saving with their next premium, and we sent our report off to their insurance brokers and explained how we'd obtained that saving, and it was, you know, effectively earned back our fee for our client in that occasion, which was I think everyone was very happy about. And finally, just to end with, I mean, we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. Here is a big site again in London that we got involved with not that long ago, and as you can see, I mean, here's an aerial photo of it. It's a big old site. You know, you've got these 14-story blocks of flats with commercial units here. There's actually a huge underground car park under here, and it's really, really massive. It's called the Hallsville Quarter. If any of you have ever passed through Canning Town, you'll probably see it to the side as you go through the tube station. And basically, we valued that building at 230 million pounds, that complex of buildings. We broke it down into 33 bite-sized lumps for the property managers, which included an Ibis hotel and a whole Morrison's supermarket, as well as about 20 other minor commercial units, cafes, shops, that sort of thing. And then there are about 10 blocks of residential flats, as well as, you know, separate figures for the car parking and so on. And each one of those sort of sub areas was given its own declared value, and this was important because the developer of the site didn't really want to give away what it had cost them to build it, because obviously that's quite commercially sensitive information, and no one wants their client to know exactly how much profit they've made out of something. And the other reason, of course, is that even if the developer did want to give away their figures, the likelihood is that the sort of rates the developer were using would probably be more competitive than you'd actually get in the open market, because this development had taken, you know, sort of 7 years in the planning. You know, they thought about literally absolutely everything, and in an insurance rebuild scenario, you would be expected to basically just clear that site and rebuild what was there, and pretty much straight away from a standing start. So obviously the overheads and the design and so on would be significantly higher. The other reason why no one could really say what it would cost to rebuild this, despite having just built it, was because a lot of the development of that site involved something called land remediation. So when you're building on an area that may have previously held, you know, gas cylinders or toxic waste or anything that's remotely nefarious, for developers these days, a lot of the costs of developing a site like that will be in land remediation, removal of asbestos, removal of underground fuel tanks, removal of just about anything really that isn't decaying biological matter. And when you're trying to tease apart those sorts of costs from the costs incurred by just developing a site from fresh, you know, it is complicated. It's not something that has a straightforward answer, unless, of course, you're used to doing these sorts of reinstatement cost assessments on a regular basis. And that's what we do, and that's what we did for these people. And we gave them their eventual declared value and cross-checked it across a variety of different sources, including other similar sites that we've done recently in London. And that's just, I suppose, a final example of how big these things can end up becoming when you get involved with the sort of the 9-figure valuations in these larger mixed-use sites. So that pretty much brings us to the end of our presentation. 10:52 a.m, 8 minutes to go. Any questions at all?
Yes, we do have some questions, James. So my first question is, would you push back on surveys that have used internal measurements?
So a lot of the time, internal measurements are used by surveyors because there is a greater sort of wealth of information on internal measurements for cost purposes than external ones. It can be done just so long as the person undertaking the survey does so with reference to the fact that the way the RICS says that you should calculate these assessments is done using the IPMS1, or the gross external area. So it's a complicated answer to a simple question, but essentially, yes, you can do it so long as you know what you're doing. Okay.
We've got a question on the first building you showed on the first one of the first slides. It said on the first example, the uplift declared value was insured was 25% uplift. It seemed a high increase. What science did you apply to the increase by the insurer? How did that work?
This was which slide, sorry?
I think that would have been like one of the first buildings, you know, when we were looking at how much the buildings are.
Oh, right, okay, so the declared value bit. So yeah, obviously, I mean, you know, if you're dealing with a big increase, you know, if a declared value has gone up by 25%, I mean, generally speaking, any kind of increase of more than 10%, we look into anyway, just to sort of double check our own figures and to understand why the previous may have had a lower figure. We would look into that with the client property manager and essentially try to work out why it is that increase has happened and why there's been such a leap. But sometimes it can simply be because the instruction given to the past surveyor was, you know, unclear. Maybe they didn't include external areas or a garage block or some part of the building, which is now being included this time around. You know, a lot of the time it's not necessarily because anyone's made any glaring errors, it's just because a different question has been asked to a different surveyor. Sometimes it can be simply due to the whole balcony question, with the difference in the way that buildings now calculated with the IPMS 1s and 2s as opposed to gross external areas of the past. But normally, if you delve in deep enough, you can find the reason for the increase. But sometimes it's not always clear, and sometimes you just have to essentially stand behind your latest valuation and present it to the client with a sort of explanation.
Okay, all right, I've got another one. So how detailed a...
Are you still with us there? I don't know.
I'm still there. I can still see. Am I? I can still see you. Can you still? Yeah. How detailed a breakdown?
I don't know. Oh, sorry.
Are you there? Can you still hear me? Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear me, or
I can
I'm
hear
only
you,
getting
yes.
some of what you're saying there, Charlotte.
I can hear you definitely. I'll carry on and see if you can hear me. If not, have a look at the Q&A button right at the bottom and see if you can see the questions if you're having trouble hearing me. So, do you need to have access to all flats if you're unable to take measurements from original plans and drawings?
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can. So, do you need to have access to all flats if you're unable to take measurements from original plans and drawings?
No, you don't need to have access to all flats. We're quite used to estimating in the world of RCAs, so it's perfectly plausible, especially during the current environment, to merely inspect the internal common parts and derive details on the internal fit out of flats simply through conversations with the property manager or through sort of freely available online sources.
Okay, cool. How detailed a breakdown of cost calculation can you ask for? Previously, some RCA providers have declined to show their workings out, simply giving a declared value. What happens when the loss adjuster says the property is underinsured? Who can arbitrate? And how often should an assessment be undertaken? Every 3 to 4 years or 7 to 9? What do you think?
The RICS recommend every 3 years for a start. When it comes to valuations, where essentially you've got a situation where two different surveyors are both claiming that they're right. Someone from 3 years ago is standing behind their figure and someone from today is standing behind theirs. There's two ways of approaching that situation from the client's perspective. You can either order what's called a double blind valuation, where a third surveyor comes out and does a fresh valuation at cost, and depending on where his figure is, and unless it's completely halfway between the two figures, normally he will come down on the side of one of the parties, and you start building a picture then of who's probably correct. But perhaps a fairer way and a better way of dealing with a situation like that is to get the two surveyors together and actually just get them to sort of decide what exactly has happened here, because normally the difference between two values like that can be simply explained by the instruction that both surveyors had at the time they carried out their assessments. So again, it comes down to different methods of valuation. Did someone use an elemental cost assessment method and someone else just use an aggregate generalized approach? It could be that one value includes all the external areas, car parking, etc., and the other one doesn't. Quite often, it's not that one party is wrong and one party is right. It's just that they've both done what they were instructed to do, but the instructions were two different things.
Okay, brilliant. And I've got time for one more question.
Yeah.
On a modern mixed estate of houses and flats, should the private road be included in the RCA? I've seen some high reinstatement figures for the road which seem unrealistic, since the road is unlikely to suffer a total loss, unlike a block of flats which is burnt down. Absolutely, very good question.
I mean, probably the first starting point is talk to your insurer and talk to your freeholder if the freeholder is not the person that you're acting for. If you're not sure who owns the road, if you're not sure if it's been adopted yet by the local authority, it's a question that you can ask your surveyor to investigate for you. Roads very rarely burn down, but they quite often get disturbed by tree roots or have to be dug up for various reasons. They can also get washed away, and it is important to include a realistic assessment cost for their reinstatement, especially if you're insuring an estate where there's quite a lot of access roads and there's a question hanging over whether the local authority will actually reimburse the costs of putting in new services, cables and so on. people are often surprised by the cost of roads. This is something I quite often find. Most people will know roughly how much it costs to have their own driveway resurfaced. If you get them to extrapolate those costs to a big area of supermarket car parking, or a big long, kilometre long access road that winds its way through a new built housing estate, it's sometimes a good way of getting them to understand just how much of an issue this can be. But in terms of whether it should be insured and who should be insuring it, if you're unsure, I would say pose it as a question to your insurance broker and take your steer from them.
Excellent. Well, look, James, thank you so much. We'll be sending a copy of your presentation to everybody who attended the session, and also we will send a copy of your presentation, and together contact details if anyone wants to contact you personally with any questions, because unfortunately we haven't been able to get through them all because there's been quite a few, but you are happy to answer any questions. I know you said that you would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And please do send in your questions privately after this. Copy of the slides is on its way to you all, and sorry we didn't have time for them all.
Oh, there was just so many. Never mind, next time. And from News on the Block, thank you so much for joining us, and we will be doing our next session on the 23rd of February when Yasmin Mistry and Andrew Morgan from JPC, they will be covering the topics of the 3 R's: roles, responsibilities and resolutions. So we will see you all in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much again, James.
Thank you.
Thank you.